Today we delve into one of the most fascinating and controversial chapters in the history of power, the scandals associated with the papacy. For centuries, the Vatican has been considered the heart of spiritual power. But behind the sacred walls of history, political games, corruption, and ruthless ambition have shaped the Church in ways many have never heard. From teenage popes and sold-out popes to secret trials and deadly feuds, we uncover the hidden truths that shook the very foundations of the Catholic Church. So fasten your seatbelts for a deep and enlightening journey through the shadows of the papal past, because history isn't always holy. So before you get comfortable, give the video a like and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Leave a comment letting me know where you're watching the video from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always amazing to see how far this little community extends. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or some soothing background noise, and let's dive into today's story together. For nearly 2 millennia, the papacy has stood as one of the most enduring and influential institutions in human history. Rooted in the belief that the Pope is the spiritual successor to Saint Peter, the apostle chosen by Jesus Christ to lead his followers, the Bishop of Rome holds a position of profound religious authority. But the power of the papacy has never been limited to the spiritual realm alone. At its height, the Vatican wielded immense political, economic, and cultural influence, shaping the course of European civilization, mediating conflicts between kings and empires, dictating moral law, and acting as the supreme voice of Christianity for millions of followers around the globe. Yet, with such vast power comes the potential for both great good and great harm. While many popes throughout history have been revered for their piety, wisdom, and efforts to guide the faithful, not all who ascended to the chair of St. Peter upheld the virtues expected of them. There have been darker chapters in the history of the papacy, times when the sacred office was corrupted by ambition, greed, cruelty, and scandal. Some popes used their position not to serve God or the Church, but to pursue personal gain, amass wealth, indulge in vice, or manipulate political systems for the benefit of their families and allies. These controversial and often shocking episodes challenge the perception of the papacy as an unbroken chain of holy and moral leadership. They serve as stark reminders that even within institutions built on spiritual ideals, human flaws and the thirst for power can take hold. In this exploration, we delve into some of the most notorious and morally compromised figures ever to occupy the highest seat in the Catholic Church. Men whose actions stained the legacy of the Vatican and left indelible marks on the pages of history. This is not a story of faith alone. It is a story of power, politics, betrayal, and at times, decadence. It is a journey through the darkest corridors of the Vatican, where robes of holiness often concealed ambitions far removed from the teachings of Christ. Let's go back to one of the darkest and most controversial periods in the history of the Catholic Church, a time known as the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age of the Papacy. This era stretched from around 904 to 964 AD and is also famously, or infamously, called the Pornocracy. That name comes from Greek and means rule of prostitutes. Why such a shocking label? Because during this time, the papacy was heavily influenced, some say controlled, by one powerful Roman family, the Theophylacts. The Theophylacts were incredibly wealthy and politically dominant in early 10th century Rome. At the head of the family was Theophylact I. He had a key financial role in the papal court and later became the Count of Tusculum. But it wasn't just the men pulling strings. In fact, it was the women of the family, especially Theophylact's wife Theodora and their daughter, Marozia, who left the biggest mark on history. These women weren't queens or popes, but they held enormous power behind the scenes. They decided who would become pope and used their influence to shape the church to fit their own political ambitions. At the center of this powerful family's grip on the church were two women, Theodora, the wife of Theophylact, and their daughter, Marozia. Writers from that time, like Liutprand of Cremona, described them as cunning and influential, using personal relationships, including alleged affairs, to gain political power. They were said to control who became pope and who was removed, all to serve their own ambitions. Now, it's true that some of these accounts may be exaggerated or shaped by the moral judgments of medieval historians. But even so, the facts clearly show Theodora and Marozia held real political power in the Vatican. Marozia, in particular, played a key role in placing her lover, Sergius III, on the papal throne. He ruled as pope from 904 to 911, and according to several sources, they had a son, John XI, who later became pope himself at just 20 years old. All of this under Marozia's watchful eye. For years, Marozia effectively ran the Vatican. She chose popes who would follow her lead and used the church as a tool to secure her family's rule over Rome. During this dark chapter in church history, favoritism, corruption, and outside political control took a serious toll on the power and respect once held by the papacy. The Pope, meant to be a spiritual guide and moral leader, was reduced to little more than a puppet in the hands of powerful noble families. The church found itself wrapped up in scandal after scandal. There were shocking rumors of affairs, political murders, and bitter feuds between rival groups. At times, these groups even went as far as choosing their own competing popes. The result? Violent clashes that shattered the image of the church and deeply damaged its spiritual authority. But change finally came. In the mid-900s, the German Ottonian dynasty stepped in. With leaders like Emperor Otto I, the church slowly began to clean up its image and reclaim its independence. These reforming emperors pushed back against corruption and helped return the papacy to a more honest and spiritual path. Still, the memory of the Pornocracy didn't just fade away. It remained a painful reminder of what can happen when spiritual leadership is overtaken by greed, lust, and political ambition. Pope John XII, born Octavianus, was pope from 955 to 964 AD and is often considered one of the most immoral popes in Catholic history. He became pope at around 18 years old, thanks to his father, Alberic II of Spoleto. Alberic, who ruled Rome and came from the powerful Theophylact family, wanted to keep control of the papacy by putting his son in charge. From the beginning, John XII treated the role of pope more like a way to enjoy power and pleasure than as a holy responsibility. According to people who lived at the time, especially Liutprand of Cremona, a bishop and diplomat, John's behavior was shocking. They claimed he turned the Lateran Palace, the Pope's official home, into something like a brothel. He was accused of having affairs with many women, including his own relatives and the widows of important Roman leaders. Liutprand listed many shocking things Pope John XII was accused of doing: making a deacon in a stable, holding mass while drunk, calling on pagan gods during gambling, and even blinding or killing church rivals. While some of these stories might have been exaggerated, since Liutprand was writing for the German emperor, most historians agree that John XII was extremely immoral and not suited to be pope. John's careless rule eventually led to his downfall. In 962, he crowned Otto I, the King of Germany, as Holy Roman Emperor. But later, John betrayed Otto by secretly working with his enemies and encouraging rebellion in Rome. In response, Otto returned, removed John from power at the Synod of Rome in 963, and appointed Pope Leo VIII instead. This caused a major split, since many Romans still believed John XII was the rightful pope. John briefly returned to power as pope in 964, after Otto left Rome. However, his return didn't last long. Later that same year, he died in unclear and disgraceful circumstances, reportedly from a stroke while in bed with a married woman. Still, some believe this story may have been a rumor created for political reasons. His time as pope is considered one of the lowest points in the Church's spiritual authority. His rule brought to light long-standing concerns about the Vatican becoming too involved in worldly affairs and losing its moral integrity. The image of a teenage pope behaving like a corrupt Roman emperor and dragging the holy office into scandal left a lasting and damaging mark on the history of the papacy. These two case studies, the domination of the Vatican by the Theophylax during the Saeculum Obscurum and the debauched rule of Pope John XII, represent one of the most controversial and disreputable chapters in the long history of the papal office. They also serve as sobering reminders of how deeply human corruption can compromise even the most sacred institutions. The Cadaver Synod, Justice Beyond the Grave, a detailed look at the strange trial of a dead pope and the deep political battles inside the Church. In the late 800s and early 900s, the Catholic Church was going through a time of chaos and political infighting. The papacy, the office of the pope, was deeply influenced by powerful noble families, particularly in Rome, who often treated the papal throne like a political prize rather than a spiritual role. Popes were chosen, removed, or even murdered based on shifting alliances and power struggles between families, kingdoms, and factions within the Church. One such pope caught in this storm was Pope Formosus, who reigned from 891 to 896 AD. Before becoming pope, Formosus had been a bishop and diplomat, gaining both admirers and enemies for his political involvement, especially in trying to align the Church with certain powerful rulers like the Carolingians, a dynasty that ruled parts of what are now France and Germany. Formosus had a long and complicated history in church politics. He was once excommunicated, cut off from the Church by a previous pope, John VIII, for overstepping his authority, but was later forgiven and restored. When he became pope, Formosus invited Arnulf of Carinthia, a German king, to invade Italy and remove Emperor Lambert of Spoleto, a rival supported by a strong Roman family. Arnulf was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Formosus in 896. However, this plan failed. Arnulf fell ill and had to leave Italy, and Lambert regained power. This left Formosus and his supporters in a dangerous position. Soon after, Formosus died, possibly from natural causes, though some theories suggest he was poisoned. After Formosus died, a few short-term popes came and went. Then in 896, Pope Stephen VI, also known as Stephen VII, became pope. He was strongly aligned with the Spoleto family, enemies of Formosus. Stephen wanted to completely erase Formosus's legacy and discredit everything he had done as pope. This led to one of the strangest events in church history, the Cadaver Synod, also called the Synodus Horrenda, or Horrible Synod. In January 897, Pope Stephen VI ordered that Formosus's body be dug up from its grave in St. Peter's Basilica, where it had been buried months earlier. The corpse, badly decayed, was dressed in papal robes, seated on a throne, and put on trial in front of a church council. During the trial, a deacon was forced to stand beside the body and speak on its behalf, answering questions like, "Why did you become pope when you were still Bishop of Porto?" A charge that Formosus had held more than one bishopric, which was against church law. Stephen VI accused Formosus of violating canon law and of being unworthy of the papacy. The court, led by Stephen himself, found the corpse guilty. As punishment, the papacy of Formosus was declared invalid. All his acts as pope were annulled. The fingers he had used to bless people were cut off. His body was stripped of its papal garments. Then, in a final act of disrespect, the corpse was thrown into a common grave. Later, it was dug up again and thrown into the Tiber River, the main river that runs through Rome. The spectacle of putting a dead pope on trial shocked and disgusted many people, even in a time of intense political corruption. The Roman public and many clergy were outraged. Not long after the trial, Pope Stephen VI faced a backlash. A rebellion broke out in Rome, and he was imprisoned and later strangled to death in prison in August 897. Later popes, starting with Pope Theodore II, tried to undo the damage. Theodore II held a short reign, but ordered that Formosus's body be recovered from the Tiber and given a proper burial. Pope John IX, who came after Theodore, held a synod that declared the Cadaver Synod invalid and forbade any future trials of dead people. However, some later popes still tried to undo or support parts of what Stephen VI had done, showing that the controversy continued for years. The Cadaver Synod became a symbol of just how far the political battles within the church had gone. It showed the dangerous mixing of religion and power, and how popes could be used or even persecuted by the factions they either helped or opposed. Even today, the event is remembered as one of the most bizarre and shameful episodes in papal history. It raised serious questions about justice, abuse of power, and the role of the church in politics. The image of a pope putting a corpse on trial remains a haunting reminder of the extremes people will go to in the name of revenge and control. The Western Schism, a church divided. By the late 1300s, the Catholic Church was already under stress. For nearly 70 years, from 1309 to 1377, the popes had lived not in Rome, but in Avignon, France. This period was known as the Avignon Papacy, and many people across Europe, especially in Italy, saw it as a time when the church was too heavily influenced by the French crown. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI moved the papacy back to Rome, trying to restore its traditional home and authority. However, when he died in 1378, the Church faced a major crisis over who would become the next pope. After Gregory XI's death, a new pope had to be elected. But the mood in Rome was tense. The Roman people demanded an Italian pope, as many feared the cardinals would choose another Frenchman and move the papacy back to Avignon. Under pressure, the mostly French group of cardinals elected Bartolomeo Prignano, an Italian who was not yet a cardinal, but had served as Archbishop of Bari. He took the name Pope Urban VI. At first, the choice seemed to satisfy everyone. He was Italian, but not connected to any major political factions. However, it quickly became clear that Urban VI had a difficult, even dangerous personality. Pope Urban VI soon showed signs of anger, arrogance, and cruelty. He criticized the cardinals openly, insulted them, and even threatened them with violence. He demanded reforms in the church, but his aggressive and hostile way of enforcing them made him many enemies, especially among the same cardinals who had elected him. He refused to listen to advice and became more tyrannical as time went on. Urban's behavior led many to question whether he was mentally stable. Some of the cardinals even claimed they had only elected him under fear and pressure from the Roman mob, and that his election was invalid because it wasn't made freely. In response to Urban VI's conduct, 13 cardinals, mostly French, left Rome and declared his election null and void. They held a new election in September 1378, choosing a different pope, Robert of Geneva, who took the name Clement VII. He set up his papal court in Avignon, starting a rival papacy. Now there were two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon, each claiming to be the true head of the church. This marked the beginning of the Western Schism, also known as the Papal Schism, which would last for nearly 40 years. The schism divided all of Catholic Europe. Different countries took sides, often based on political alliances rather than religious belief. France, Scotland, Spain, and some Italian states supported Clement VII in Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and much of northern Italy supported Urban VI in Rome. Each pope excommunicated the followers of the other, and the church became deeply split, not only at the political level, but also in the eyes of ordinary Christians, who were confused about which pope was the true leader. Urban VI remained pope in Rome until his death in 1389, and his reign continued to be marked by violence. He even tortured and executed cardinals who opposed him, including those he suspected of conspiring against him. After Urban's death, his successors continued the Roman line of popes, while the Avignon popes maintained their own line. Eventually, a third line of popes was created in an attempt to resolve the issue. In 1409, a church council in Pisa tried to fix the schism by deposing both the Roman and Avignon popes and electing a new pope, Alexander V. But instead of solving the problem, this move created a third pope, making things even more confusing. The schism finally ended at the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, where church leaders and political rulers came together to resolve the crisis. The council forced the resignation of the Pope in Pisa and deposed the Avignon Pope. The Roman Pope at the time, Gregory XII, agreed to step down voluntarily. In 1417, the council elected a new pope, Martin V, who was accepted by almost everyone. This marked the official end of the Western Schism and restored unity to the papacy. The Western Schism left a long-lasting mark on the Catholic Church. It made many believers lose trust in the Pope's authority. It damaged the Church's image because people saw how political fights and power struggles had taken over its leadership. This caused many to call for change, which eventually led to even bigger problems later on, like the Protestant Reformation. The schism also revealed a serious flaw in the Church's system. There was no clear way to settle arguments about who the real pope was. It showed how risky it is when the Church becomes too deeply involved in politics. The Borgia papacy, nepotism and notoriety. Who were the Borgias? The Borgias were a Spanish-Italian family that rose to great power in the 15th century, especially in the Catholic Church. They became one of the most infamous families in European history, often associated with greed, corruption, scandal, and murder. Their name is most often linked with Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, whose time as Pope, 1492 to 1503, was one of the most controversial in Church history. Rodrigo Borgia was born in Spain in 1431 and came from a powerful family. His uncle, Pope Calixtus III, made sure Rodrigo received top positions in the Church early in life. Rodrigo became a cardinal and later the vice-chancellor of the Church, one of the most important positions in the Vatican. He held this post for over 35 years, gaining wealth, influence, and many political allies. In 1492, after the death of Pope Innocent VIII, Rodrigo Borgia was elected pope. He took the name Pope Alexander VI. His election was widely believed to have involved simony, the buying and selling of church offices. Many claimed that Rodrigo paid large bribes to other cardinals to secure their votes. As pope, Alexander VI was known for nepotism, the practice of giving high-ranking church or political positions to family members. He openly promoted his children, especially his son, Cesare Borgia, and daughter Lucrezia Borgia. Although popes were expected to live celibate lives, Alexander VI had several mistresses and multiple children, whom he recognized publicly. He used the papacy to advance their careers and gain land, titles, and power. Cesare Borgia was made a cardinal while still young, and later became a powerful military leader. Alexander helped him conquer territories in central Italy. Lucrezia Borgia was used as a tool for forming alliances, married off several times to noble families for political gain. These actions were seen as deeply corrupt and scandalous, even by the standards of the time. Pope Alexander VI was also known for living in luxury. He hosted elaborate feasts and celebrations, sometimes with questionable behavior. His court at the Vatican became a symbol of excess and immorality. Stories spread, some true, others exaggerated, about orgies, bribery, and poisonings. Though many of these tales were fueled by enemies of the Borgias, Alexander's papacy was clearly marked by favoritism, corruption, and greed. Alexander VI was also deeply involved in the politics of the time. He worked hard to protect and expand his family's influence by forming and breaking alliances with powerful rulers such as the kings of France, Spain, and Naples. He supported France's King Charles VIII during his invasion of Italy, then later turned against him when it suited his goals. Alexander constantly shifted loyalties to maintain power and secure territories for Caesarea. He even used the Church's power to issue papal bulls, official decrees that shaped world history, like the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided newly discovered lands outside Europe between Spain and Portugal. By the time Alexander VI died in 1503, the papacy was seen by many as deeply corrupted. His reign had made people question the moral integrity of the Church. While some admired his political skill and boldness, most remembered him for manipulating the Church for personal and family gain. After his death, his son Cesare tried to hold on to power, but quickly lost his influence. Many of the Borgia family's allies turned against them. The family's reputation never recovered. The corruption during Alexander VI's rule contributed to growing demands for church reform. His papacy was one of several that helped fuel criticism of the Church's leadership, setting the stage for the Protestant Reformation in the early 1500s. The Borgia papacy became a symbol of everything critics believed was wrong with the Catholic Church at the time: abuse of power, greed, moral failure, and a lack of spiritual leadership. Pope Alexander VI's reign remains one of the most controversial chapters in the history of the Catholic Church. His time as Pope was filled with ambition, manipulation, and scandal. While he was a skilled politician and administrator, his actions deeply damaged the Church's reputation and helped spark calls for major reform. The legacy of the Borgia family lives on today as a reminder of how power, when unchecked by morals or duty, can corrupt even the highest offices of faith. The sale of the papacy. Benedict IX scandal. Pope Benedict IX is one of the most infamous figures in the long history of the Catholic Church. He served as pope not once, but 3 separate times in the 11th century, making him the only person in history to do so. His time in power was filled with corruption, scandal, and political chaos, and he is perhaps most remembered for an outrageous act: selling the papacy. Benedict IX was born around 1012 into the powerful Tusculani family, which controlled much of Rome and the papacy at the time. His real name was Theophactus of Tusculum, and he was likely in his early 20s or even younger when he first became pope in 1032. His rise to power wasn't due to religious leadership or spiritual devotion. It was the result of his family's political influence. His father, Count Alberic III of Tusculum, used his wealth and power to push his son into the papal office. From the start, Benedict IX's time as pope was widely condemned. Contemporary writers, including church historians, described him as corrupt, immoral, and unfit for the role. He was accused of committing serious sins such as simony, buying and selling church positions, violence, sexual misconduct, and general lawlessness. Some accounts even called his behavior a disgrace to the chair of St. Peter. People both inside and outside the church were shocked by how openly he abused his position. In 1044, a revolt broke out in Rome due to growing anger over Benedict's behavior. He was forced out of the city, and a new pope, Sylvester III, was elected by Benedict's enemies. But Benedict still had supporters and managed to return to power just a few months later in 1045, forcing Sylvester out. This created confusion. There were now two men claiming to be pope, both backed by different political groups. But what happened next shocked even the most cynical observers of the time. In May 1045, Benedict IX resigned from the papacy, but not out of guilt or humility. He sold the office to his godfather, John Gratian, a respected churchman who wanted to restore honor to the papal seat. John Gratian paid a large sum of money to Benedict, supposedly to help him marry a woman he loved, although that marriage never happened. John Gratian became pope under the name Gregory VI, but the sale of the papacy caused outrage. Even though Gregory VI was a good man, the very idea that the holy office could be bought and sold like property was shocking and deeply offensive to many Christians. This event is considered one of the lowest points in the history of the papacy, and it clearly showed how far the church had strayed from its spiritual roots. The scandal didn't end there. Benedict IX regretted giving up power and soon tried to reclaim the papacy. For a time, there were three rival popes: Benedict IX, Gregory VI, and Sylvester III, all claiming to be the true pope. In 1046, King Henry III of Germany stepped in to solve the crisis. He called the Council of Sutri, where all three popes were either deposed or forced to resign. A new pope, Clement II, was chosen by Henry and recognized by the Church. Benedict IX was excommunicated for a time, but later reconciled with the Church before his death. Benedict IX's actions are often remembered as one of the darkest chapters in papal history. His sale of the papacy represents the commodification of a sacred office, treating the leadership of the Church as if it were something to buy, sell, or trade, rather than a divine calling. His behavior fueled demands for reform within the Church and helped lay the groundwork for later efforts to separate church leadership from political and financial corruption. Pope Benedict IX's scandalous life and actions showed just how corrupt the Church had become in the early 11th century. By treating the papacy like a personal possession, he weakened the Church's authority and spiritual credibility. His story is often used as a warning about what can happen when power, money, and politics take over a role meant to be guided by faith and service. The Church would eventually move toward reform, but not before enduring more turmoil sparked by leaders like Benedict IX. The Inquisition intensified Paul IV's reign of intolerance. Pope Paul IV, born Gian Pietro Carafa in 1476, became pope in 1555 and ruled until his death in 1559. Before becoming pope, he had a long career in the Church as a strict and serious reformer. He believed the Catholic Church needed to be purified from corruption, but his version of purification often came with severe punishments, harsh intolerance, and extreme policies. His papacy came during the time of the Counter-Reformation, a movement by the Catholic Church to respond to the spread of Protestantism and to reform itself from within. However, Paul IV's methods were some of the most oppressive and hardline seen during this period. Even before he became pope, Carafa had helped re-establish the Roman Inquisition in 1542, a church court that investigated and punished heresy, beliefs that went against Catholic teachings. But once he became pope, Paul IV took the Inquisition to a much more extreme level. He believed that anyone who disagreed with official church teachings was dangerous. Under his leadership, the Inquisition expanded its reach, targeting not only Protestants, but also Catholic thinkers, scientists, artists, and anyone who questioned church authority. Used torture and secret trials to extract confessions from the accused. Imprisoned or executed many people, including clergy, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens. One famous victim was Cardinal Giovanni Morone, who was falsely accused of heresy and imprisoned for years without trial. Even after Paul IV's death, Morone was found innocent and released. Paul IV also created a list known as the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or the Index of Forbidden Books. This was a list of books that Catholics were not allowed to read, own, or publish. The index included works by Protestant writers, scientific thinkers, and even Catholic authors who had written anything critical of the Church. His goal was to control information and limit the spread of ideas that challenged church teachings. People caught with forbidden books could be punished by the Inquisition. One of Paul IV's most infamous actions was his treatment of Jewish communities in Rome and other parts of the Papal States. In 1555, he issued a papal decree called Cum Nimis Absurdum, which forced Jews to live in a walled area of Rome known as the Roman Ghetto, the first official Jewish ghetto in the city's history. Required Jews to wear special clothing or badges so they could be easily identified. Banned Jews from owning property, running certain businesses, or interacting freely with Christians. Ordered that synagogues be reduced in number and that Jews could not study important Jewish texts freely. These policies were based on Paul IV's belief that Jews were spiritually inferior and should be separated from Christians. His rules remained in effect for many years, even after his death, and set a pattern of discrimination that continued in later church policy. Paul IV was also known for his hostility toward Protestants, whom he saw as dangerous enemies of the Church. He believed in using force and censorship to crush any sign of Protestant influence in Italy. But he wasn't only hard on Protestants. He was also suspicious of moderate Catholics and anyone who supported compromise or peaceful discussion. He fired many church officials he didn't trust and made enemies across Europe. He even clashed with King Philip II of Spain, one of the most Catholic monarchs of the time. When Pope Paul IV died in 1559, many Romans were relieved. He had ruled with such strictness and fear that people openly celebrated his death. Rioters burned the buildings of the Inquisition in Rome, destroyed statues and symbols of Paul IV, tried to erase his memory because of the suffering and division he had caused. Paul IV's reign is remembered as one of the most harsh and intolerant periods in papal history. While he believed he was defending the faith and purifying the Church, his methods caused fear and suffering among Jews, Protestants, and even faithful Catholics. A climate of censorship and suspicion that stifled learning and creativity. Long-term damage to the Church's reputation especially in how it treated minorities and dissenters. His actions are often seen as an example of religious extremism, where the desire to protect faith crosses into cruelty and injustice. Pope Paul IV's time as pope was marked by intense religious control, harsh punishment, and deep intolerance. His expansion of the Inquisition and creation of the Roman ghetto show how the Church, under his leadership, used fear and force to keep power. His papacy left behind a legacy of division, discrimination, and suppression, revealing the darker side of Church history during the Counter-Reformation. The Reformation catalyst, Leo X's Indulgences. Pope Leo X, born Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici in 1475, became pope in 1513 and ruled until 1521. He was a member of the powerful Medici family of Florence, famous for its wealth, political power, and support of the arts. Leo X was highly educated, charming, and cultured, but he was also known for being extravagant and more interested in politics and luxury than spiritual leadership. His papacy is most remembered for playing a key role in starting the Protestant Reformation, largely because of his decision to sell indulgences to raise money. In the Catholic Church at the time, an indulgence was a document sold to people that promised reduced punishment for sins, either for themselves or for loved ones who had died. The Church taught that even forgiven sins required a time of purification in purgatory before a soul could enter heaven. Originally, indulgences were meant to be part of a larger process that included confession, repentance, and good deeds. But over time, they were abused and turned into a money-making tool. By the early 1500s, indulgences were being sold like commercial products, sometimes with the false promise that buying one could completely erase all sins or guarantee a loved one's immediate entry into heaven. Pope Leo X inherited major financial problems when he took office. One of his biggest goals was to rebuild and expand St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a massive and costly project that symbolized the power and glory of the Church. To fund this, Leo X authorized the widespread sale of indulgences across Europe. He sent out preachers and agents, most famously a German friar named Johann Tetzel, who used emotional tactics to pressure people into buying indulgences. Tetzel reportedly said things like, "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." This practice deeply disturbed many Christians who felt that the Church was exploiting people's faith and fears just to raise money. It also blurred the line between spiritual salvation and financial transaction, making it seem as if heaven could be bought. One of the most vocal critics of indulgence sales was a German monk and theology professor named Martin Luther. In 1517, Luther wrote his famous 95 Theses, a list of arguments challenging the Church's teachings and practices, especially the abuse of indulgences. He nailed the document to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany, sparking a massive religious movement now known as the Protestant Reformation. Luther argued that salvation could not be bought. It came through faith alone. The Church had no authority to sell forgiveness. Popes and priests had become too corrupt and power-hungry. When Leo X heard about Luther's actions, he at first dismissed him as a minor troublemaker. But as Luther gained supporters, Leo excommunicated him in 1521, declaring him a heretic. However, by that time, the Reformation had already begun to spread rapidly. While people across Europe were being pressured to buy indulgences, Leo X was living a life of great luxury in Rome. He, through lavish feasts and celebrations, supported artists like Raphael and other Renaissance masters, spent huge sums on clothes, art, and architecture, drained the church's treasury, and even borrowed money to support his spending. This made the contrast between the church's teachings and its actual behavior even more obvious. Many people saw Leo X as a symbol of the church's greed and moral decay. Pope Leo X's decision to finance church projects by selling indulgences helped trigger one of the most important events in Christian history, the Protestant Reformation. His actions, though not unusual for his time, exposed deep problems within the church: abuse of spiritual power for money, lack of accountability at the highest levels of leadership, detachment from the needs and concerns of ordinary believers. These events forced the Catholic Church to eventually face serious calls for reform. In the years and decades that followed, church leaders began to clean up some of the worst abuses, partly in response to the criticism and competition from Protestant reformers. The story of Leo X reminds us that when religious institutions become too focused on wealth and power, they risk losing their moral authority. It also shows the importance of listening to criticism, correcting wrongdoing, and keeping religious leadership focused on faith, service, and humility.